The church bells had rung that morning with a promise of joy. White ribbons decorated the pews, and neighbors gathered with smiles that carried more curiosity than warmth. In the center of it all stood Clara May, dressed in a simple white gown her mother had sewn, hands trembling as she clutched the bouquet of wildflowers she had picked from the field herself. Her heart pounded, not from excitement, but from fear. She had always been told she was too quiet, too plain, too strange. Yet here she was, finally being chosen. Or so she believed. The whispers began when the groom did not arrive. At first, people shifted in their seats, murmuring that perhaps he had been delayed. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. A child giggled nervously, and the sound carried louder than it should have in the tense silence. Clara kept her eyes fixed on the door, praying that any moment it would open, that he would walk through and rescue her from his growing humiliation. But the door never opened. Instead, an older woman leaned toward her neighbor and hissed, "I told you, she's cursed. No man would marry trouble like her." Laughter rippled in hushed tones across the church. Clara's cheeks burned, her breath came shallow, and her knees threatened to buckle beneath her gown. The pastor, shifting uncomfortably, tried to soothe the crowd, but it was useless. Everyone had already decided. The bride had been abandoned. Tears blurred Clara's vision as she lowered her bouquet. The white petals shook in her trembling hands until they scattered across the aisle, trampled by the shoes of those eager to leave. She heard the sharp voices, the cruel chuckles, the pitying sighs. Some looked at her as though she were to be pitied, others as though she had brought the shame upon herself. No one reached out to comfort her, not even a single hand. She fled before anyone could say more, the hem of her dress catching mud as she ran down the church steps into the empty street. The sky seemed to darken, heavy clouds rolling in as though nature itself mourned with her. Her chest heaved, and she pressed a hand to her stomach, feeling the hollow ache of rejection. She had not only lost a groom, she had lost whatever fragile dignity she once had. By evening, the story spread to the town like wildfire. In the saloon, men laughed over their whiskey, muttering, "The bride no one wanted." At the market, women whispered behind their hands, casting sidelong glances as she walked past. Children mocked her in the alleys, pulling at the ragged edge of her ruined gown. Clara tried to keep her chin high, but every word cut like a knife. Each insult deepened the wound until she wondered if she could survive the shame. Her tiny rented room felt more like a prison that night. She sat by the window, gown torn, hair falling loose around her shoulders. The candle burned low, and in its flickering light, she saw the reflection of a woman she barely recognized. Her eyes were swollen from weeping, her lips cracked from silence, and her heart heavy with disbelief. She had not been abandoned once. She had been abandoned all her life, by fortune, by kindness, by love. Her thoughts wandered back to her childhood, to the days when her mother used to whisper stories of hope while brushing her hair. Her mother had died too soon, leaving Clara to grow up under the weight of loneliness. Now, as a young woman, she was still that same lonely girl, only branded more cruelly, branded publicly. It wasn't just that a man had walked away. It was that the world now had proof of what they always suspected. She was unworthy. The night grew colder, and the sound of distant laughter drifted in through the thin walls. Clara curled into herself on the narrow bed, clutching the torn gown as if it could shield her. She prayed to forget, prayed for the strength to vanish from a world that had no place for her. But no matter how tightly she shut her eyes, she could still hear the echoes of those words. She's cursed. She's trouble. No man will ever want her. Her chest tightened with a mix of grief and fury. How cruel people could be, how swift to judge without knowing the heart beneath. She had only ever longed for belonging, for a hand to hold through the storms of life. Was that too much to ask? The ache in her soul told her it was. As dawn broke the next morning, Clara stood at the window, watching the sun rise over the dusty horizon. The town was already awake, people beginning their routines, but she felt like a shadow drifting among them. No greetings, no smiles, only stares. She pulled a shawl tight around her shoulders and whispered to herself in a voice too soft for anyone else to hear. Maybe I was never meant to be someone's choice. The sun climbed slowly over the rolling hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Out on the edge of town, far from the gossiping voices and prying eyes, stood a weather-worn ranch. Its fences leaned tightly against the wind, and its barn carried scars of storms long past. This was where Ethan Cole lived, or rather, existed. A man of few words, broad-shouldered and hardened by years of toil. He had long ago traded companionship for silence. Once, the ranch had been filled with laughter, a wife's soft humming as she tended the kitchen, the eager footsteps of a child chasing after a dog in the yard. But tragedy had stolen it all. First his wife in childbirth, then the child who did not survive beyond his first winter. Ethan buried them both beneath the oak tree that still shaded the ranch house. Since then, his heart had been locked away, the soil of his soul hardened like the drought-stricken earth he worked. The townsfolk respected him, but from a distance. They called him dependable, but also untouchable. He was a man who fixed his own fences, bought only what he needed, and kept his gaze low when passing through town. He shared no drink at the saloon, no laughter at Sunday gatherings. For many, Ethan Cole was a mystery wrapped in quiet grief, and they left him to his solitude. That morning, he rode into town to trade supplies. Dust clung to his boots and hat as he guided his horse down the main street. He was accustomed to ignoring the chatter around him, but something in the air felt different. The whispers weren't about cattle prices or the latest storm. They carried a sharper edge, hushed yet eager. Ethan slowed his stride, his brow furrowing as he caught fragments of words. Bride, unwanted, cursed. It was then that he saw her. She walked quickly, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the ground as though the weight of every stare pressed against her. Her dress, though once white, was torn and stained, a cruel reminder of what had happened the day before. The townsfolk parted for her, not out of kindness, but to avoid being tainted by her disgrace. Children snickered, women whispered, men shook their heads, and through it all, the young woman kept moving, face pale and lips trembling. Ethan felt an unexpected jolt in his chest. He had seen brokenness before, in animals wounded by predators, in men worn down by war, but never like this. This was a soul shattered in public view, left with nowhere to hide. For reasons he couldn't explain, his eyes followed her until she vanished around the corner. He turned away, but the image of her lingered. He told himself it was not his concern. A woman's heartbreak was not a rancher's business. Yet, as he loaded supplies onto his wagon, he found his hands moving slower, his thoughts drifting back to her bowed head and trembling shoulders. The memory of her pain clung to him like dust in the summer wind. On his way back to the ranch, Ethan tried to shake the feeling. He focused on the creak of the wagon wheels, the steady rhythm of his horse's hooves, the wide expanse of land stretching endlessly before him. But solitude, once his shield, now felt strangely heavy. He realized that for the first time in years, someone else's sorrow had pierced through the walls he had built. That night, he sat on the porch of his cabin, the familiar oak tree casting shadows in the moonlight. He held a tin cup of coffee in his calloused hands, staring out at the horizon. The silence pressed in, but instead of peace, he felt restlessness. He thought of the girl again, of the way the town had branded her with cruel words, of the way she seemed to fold into herself as if trying to disappear. His jaw tightened. He knew too well what it meant to live with ghosts, to carry scars unseen by the world. And though he didn't know her name, he knew this. She was not just a spectacle for others to mock. She was a wound walking in plain sight. For the first time in years, Ethan whispered into the night, as if speaking to the ghosts who lingered in the oak's shadow. Why her? Why now? There was no answer, only the rustle of the wind through the grass. But deep within, Ethan Cole felt something stir, something he thought had long been buried. A pull, an unspoken connection, the recognition of pain meeting pain. And though he didn't yet understand it, he knew one thing for certain. His solitude was no longer enough. The morning sun had barely touched the rooftops when Clara forced herself out of bed in the tiny room she had rented above the seamstress's shop. Her body still felt heavy, weighed down by humiliation and sleepless nights, but she couldn't afford to disappear. If she didn't work, she wouldn't eat, And after what happened at the church, the last thing she wanted was to depend on anyone's pity. She tied her hair back, pulled her faded shawl over her shoulders, and made her way to the general store. The owner, Mr. Grady, was a stern man but fair, and though his wife had protested, he had allowed Clara to sweep floors and stock shelves in exchange for a few coins. It wasn't much, but it was survival. Yet the work came with whispers. Every time Clara bent to gather a sack of flour, she felt the sting of eyes on her. When she dusted shelves, hushed voices rose just loud enough for her to hear. That's her, the cursed bride. No man would take her. Best stay clear or misfortune follows. Clara kept her head low, biting her tongue until it almost bled. She told herself she could endure it, that survival mattered more than pride. But when a pair of women came in, loud and sharp, their words pierced deeper than any blade. "Well, look at her," one said with mock sweetness. "Guess a wedding dress don't make a wife." The other laughed. "No, it makes a fool." Can't blame the poor man for running. Heat burned Clara's face. Her hands trembled as she set down the basket she carried. She wanted to shout, to tell them they didn't know her story, but the lump in her throat stole every word. And then silence. The laughter died, not because the women had lost interest, but because someone else had entered the store. Heavy boots struck the wooden floor, steady and unhurried. The air shifted, like a storm cloud rolling in over a quiet prairie. Clara didn't have to look up to know who it was. She felt it, the weight of his presence. Ethan Cole, the cowboy, stood tall in the doorway, hat low over his eyes, his broad shoulders dark against the morning light. He said nothing, only fixed those women with a gaze that made their words shrivel in their throats. No threats, no anger, just silence, a silence heavier than steel. The women shifted uneasily, muttering excuses as they gathered their things. Their voices faded, and soon the bell above the door jingled as they hurried out, leaving only dust in their wake. Clara's heart pounded. Her hands gripped the counter, as if to keep herself from trembling. Slowly, she lifted her eyes, and found his. For the briefest moment, the world disappeared. The shelves, the whispers, the sting of shame. There was only him, his gaze steady, unreadable yet not unkind. In his eyes, she did not see ridicule. She saw recognition, a quiet understanding, as if he knew what it meant to carry scars invisible to everyone else. Her lips parted, searching for words, but none came. He gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, before stepping forward to place a list on the counter. His voice, when it came, was deep and calm. "Supplies?" That was all he said. No speeches, no defense of her. And yet, Clara felt more protected in that silence than she ever had under anyone's words. She gathered his items quickly, still stealing glances when she thought he wouldn't notice. The way he stood, steady, grounded, made the room feel different, safer. She caught her reflection in a jar's glass, and for a fleeting second, she did not see the bride no one wanted. She saw a woman still standing, still breathing, still capable of being seen. When Ethan collected his things, his fingers brushed hers. The touch was accidental, brief, but it sent a warmth through Clara's chest that startled her. He gave another small nod before turning to leave. The bell above the door jingled once more, and then he was gone. But the echo of that moment lingered. Clara exhaled shakily, pressing a hand against her chest. For days she had been drowning under the weight of rejection, yet one glance from a silent cowboy had pulled her above water, just enough to breathe. Out on the street, Ethan adjusted the strap of his satchel, his jaw set. He had meant to simply buy supplies and return to his solitude. But her eyes, they had stopped him cold. Eyes filled with pain, yes, but also with a fight that refused to die. He told himself he didn't care, that her struggle wasn't his to carry. And yet, as he mounted his horse, he found himself glancing back at the store's window. She was still inside, sweeping the floor again, pretending not to notice him. Ethan tipped his hat to no one in particular and turned his horse toward the horizon. But deep within, he knew something had shifted. For the first time in years, he had felt a spark. And whether he wanted it or not, that spark was tied to the girl the world had branded unwanted. The storm came without warning. One moment the sky was pale with dusk. The next it had turned into a furious sea of thunderclouds. Wind howled through the town, slamming shutters and rattling signboards. Clara clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she hurried down the muddy street, praying she could reach her small room above the seamstress's shop before the rain broke. But fate had other plans. Her foot caught on a loose plank, and she stumbled hard, twisting her ankle. Pain shot up her leg, forcing her to lean against the side of a building. The storm split open then, rain lashing down in icy sheets. Clara winced, dragging herself into the open street, half limping, half running, though each step was agony. Through the blur of rain, a figure emerged on horseback, broad shoulders beneath a soaked coat, hat pulled low against the downpour. He reined in sharply when he saw her, swinging down without hesitation. "Clara." His voice was firm, steady against the storm. "Ethan Cole." I'll manage," she tried to say, but her words drowned beneath thunder. He didn't argue. His arm slipped beneath her shoulders, lifting her with surprising gentleness. Before she could protest, he had guided her to his horse, settling her carefully in the saddle before mounting behind her. The ride through the storm was wordless. Clara's heart pounded, not just from fear of the tempest, but from a nearness of him. The steady strength that seemed to shield her even as the world raged around them. When the dim outline of a cabin appeared through the rain, she felt both relief and something she couldn't name. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of pine and old smoke. Ethan guided her to a chair near the hearth, where he knelt to kindle a fire. Sparks leapt, catching quickly, until warm light spilled across the rough-hewn walls. Clara shivered, clutching her shawl, watching him move with quiet efficiency. She had imagined his ranch would be grand, sprawling with wealth, but it was simple, lonely. A single-room cabin, sparse furniture, shelves lined with tools and worn books. The kind of place a man lived in when he expected nothing more than survival. Ethan handed her a blanket. "Sit, rest that ankle." Clara murmured thanks, pulling it around herself. The heat from the fire crept into her bones, chasing away the cold of the storm. For a long while, silence filled the cabin. The crackle of flames, the rhythm of rain on the roof, and the occasional creak of wood. But silence, Clara realized, wasn't empty here. It was steady, safe. She broke first. Her voice was soft, as if confessing to the fire instead of to him. "They laughed at me again today. In the store. They say I'm cursed. That no man in his right mind would want me." Her fingers clenched tighter around the blanket. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I was never meant to be someone's choice. I tried to stand tall, but it feels like the whole world sees me as a mistake." Ethan was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. Then he said, his tone low and rough, "People talk because it keeps them from looking at their own emptiness. Doesn't mean a word if it's true." Clara blinked, surprised at the gentleness beneath his gravelly voice. "And you? Do you think I'm a mistake?" Ethan's eyes met hers. In their depths she saw no judgment, no pity. Just something steady, something that made her chest ache. "No," he said simply. The firelight threw shadows across his face, tracing lines of weariness etched deep by years of solitude. For the first time, Clara noticed a heaviness in his eyes, like a man who carried too many ghosts. "You live out here alone," she whispered. "Why?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he would close himself off. But then he sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Used to have family here. Wife, son." His words came slowly, like stones dragged from a riverbed. "Lost them both. After that, the house felt too big. So I let the walls shrink to match what was left of me." Clara's breath caught. The pain in his voice wasn't loud, but it was raw, unvarnished, a loneliness that mirrored her own. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Ethan shrugged, though his eyes betrayed him. "Don't be. Sorry won't change what's gone. Just leaves a man with silence for company." Clara looked into the fire, the warmth blurring her vision. She had thought her heartbreak was unbearable, but sitting across from him, she realized grief came in many shapes. Hers humiliation, his loss. Different wounds, same emptiness. The storm raged on outside, But inside, something fragile began to grow. They didn't speak much after that. Words weren't needed. Instead, they sat in the glow of the fire, two broken souls, bound by unspoken understanding. At one point, Clara's head dipped against a chair, exhaustion tugging at her eyelids. Ethan noticed, rising to gently adjust the blanket around her shoulders. His hand lingered just a moment too long before pulling back. She stirred, eyes half open. Their gazes met again, the fire painting her features in gold. Her lips parted as if to speak, but the words died. Instead, silence hung heavy between them, a silence that said more than language ever could. And in that silence, a bond began to take root. Not yet love, not yet trust, but a seed, small and stubborn, refusing to be crushed by storm or sorrow. That night, as Clara drifted into uneasy sleep, she thought of the whispers that had haunted her for weeks. Unwanted, cursed, mistake. But here, wrapped in warmth she hadn't felt in so long, she found herself wondering if maybe, just maybe, they were wrong. And across the room, Ethan sat in the firelight long after she closed her eyes, watching the storm ease beyond the window. For the first time in years, he wasn't entirely alone. The morning after the storm, Clara awoke to the soft creak of floorboards and the smell of fresh coffee. Ethan was already moving about the cabin, his presence steady and quiet, like the hum of the earth itself. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, still half caught in the strangeness of waking under a stranger's roof. Yet it didn't feel unsafe. If anything, it felt sheltered. When she limped outside later, the world seemed washed clean. The land stretched endlessly, dotted with sagebrush and kissed by sunlight breaking through thin clouds. Clara felt small against the horizon, yet the vastness carried a strange comfort. She thought of the voices in town, the cruel laughter, the whispers that had chased her like shadows, and she wondered how much longer she could carry them. The town didn't let her forget. When Ethan took her into town later that week for supplies, whispers rose like smoke from every corner. Men leaned on railings, smirking. Women whispered behind gloves, their eyes darting toward her like sharp needles. The bride no one wanted. The cursed girl. The words weren't said outright, but Clara felt them heavy on her skin. She lowered her gaze, heart twisting, wishing she could vanish into the dust. But then she felt Ethan step closer. His presence was like a wall at her back, not forceful, just immovable. When a group of men laughed loudly in her direction, Ethan's voice cut through, low and steady. "She's not unwanted. Not while I'm here." The street went silent. No one dared meet his eyes. Clara froze, her breath caught in her throat. He hadn't raised his voice, but his words carried more weight than any shout. For the first time since her humiliation, someone had spoken for her, not out of pity, not out of obligation, but with a vow she didn't understand. Later, when they returned to the ranch, Clara found herself replaying his words. "Not while I'm here." The sentence circled in her mind like a secret fire, warming a part of her she thought had died. But with the warmth came fear. She had trusted before, once, and it had ended in humiliation so deep she thought she'd never climb out. What if this was no different? What if she began to believe in him, only to be abandoned again? She wrapped those questions tightly around her heart, like armor against disappointment. Ethan didn't press her. He didn't act like a man who'd made some grand promise. Instead, he went about his days as though nothing had changed, working the fences, tending the cattle, sharpening tools by the porch at night. Yet Clara noticed small things. He slowed his stride so she could keep pace despite her ankle. He left coffee steaming for her in the mornings. He asked no questions when she fell into silence, but she could feel his patience, like the steady ground beneath her feet. Underscore, 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 underscore. Life on the ranch began to weave them together in ways neither expected. Clara insisted on helping, though Ethan tried to keep her work light. She carried buckets, swept the porch, mended torn shirts. He showed her how to feed the horses, how to check the tack, how to walk the fences for weak posts. They laughed once, truly laughed, when Clara dropped a bucket of water and it splashed them both from head to toe. She covered her face in embarrassment. But Ethan only shook his head, grinning for the first time she could remember. It was small, fleeting, but it lit something inside her. In those simple tasks, trust began to grow. They didn't speak of the past often. Some wounds were too deep for easy words. But in the rhythm of work, in the quiet of evenings when the sky bled orange and gold, they found something unspoken, a steady companionship that didn't demand, didn't judge. Underscore, 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 underscore. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Clara stood by the corral fence, watching the horses move in lazy circles. Ethan came up beside her, his presence a shadow against a fading light. Their arms brushed lightly, just enough to send a ripple through her. Neither moved away. She could feel the warmth of him, smell the faint leather and smoke that clung to his coat. Her heart stumbled in her chest, traitorous and eager. For a fleeting second, she imagined leaning against him, imagined what it might feel like to let herself be held. But the fear clamped down quickly. She straightened, pulling her shawl tighter. Ethan glanced at her, as though he'd sensed a retreat, but he said nothing. His silence wasn't cold, though. It was patient, like he knew her battle wasn't with him, but with her own broken heart. Underscore, 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 underscore. Nights at the ranch grew gentler. Clara would sew near the fire, while Ethan mended tools or read worn books whose covers had long since frayed. Sometimes he would offer her a mug of tea, their fingers brushing as he handed it over. The touches were accidental, fleeting, but every time her breath caught, and she couldn't help wondering if he felt it too. One night, the firelight flickered across his face as he closed the book and set it aside. His voice was quiet, almost lost in the crackle of flames. You don't have to listen to them. The town, the whispers, they don't know you. Clara looked up, startled by the softness in his tone. They don't need to, she said bitterly. They've already decided what I am. Ethan shook his head, then let them be wrong. I don't see a cursed woman, Clara. I see someone still standing after being broken. That's strength, not shame. Her throat tightened. No one had ever said that to her before. That night, when she lay in the small bed he'd given her in the corner of the cabin, she couldn't sleep. His words replayed again and again, weaving through her fears, tugging against the walls she'd built around herself. She didn't know if she could let them down. But for the first time in so long, she wanted to try. And across the cabin, Ethan sat awake by the dying fire, staring into the embers. He hadn't meant to speak so openly, but watching her face, the way her eyes had shown with fragile hope, he knew he'd meant every word. He had vowed it silently long ago, never to let anyone close enough to wound him again. But something about Claire was different. Something about her pain called his own, and though he couldn't yet name it, he felt it stirring in him. The beginning of something stronger than solitude, stronger even than fear. The first hints of trouble arrived with the dust. Clara stood at the porch of the cabin, folding laundry in the sunlight, when she noticed a cloud rising on the far horizon. It wasn't the soft haze of cattle moving across pasture land. This was sharper, darker, swirling like trouble. By the time Ethan rode in from checking the north fence, her unease had turned into certainty. "They're coming," he said simply, dismounting with grim eyes. His hand lingered on the rifle slung over his shoulder. Clara swallowed hard. "Bandits." Ethan gave a tight nod. "They've been sniffing around for weeks." Guess they finally worked up the nerve. Her stomach twisted, but she forced herself to stand steady. Fear had ruled her life for too long. The town's scorn, her groom's betrayal, her shame. She couldn't run anymore. Not here, not now. This ranch was the first place where she'd begun to feel something like belonging, and she wouldn't let it be ripped away. The riders came into view. 6 men, faces hidden beneath dusty hats, guns glinting in the afternoon light. They didn't waste words. The leader, a scar-jawed man with a voice like gravel, called out as they circled closer. "Ranch looks mighty lonesome, Cowboy. Shame if something happened to it." Ethan's jaw tightened. "This land ain't yours to touch. Turn around before you regret it." Scarjaw smirked, spitting into the dirt. Big words for one man. "But I hear you taking in a woman. The cursed bride, wasn't it? Don't worry. We'll take good care of her." Clara's blood turned to ice. Their laughter rang out, cruel and sharp, cutting deeper than any blade. Once, she would have wilted under those words, shrinking smaller and smaller until nothing was left. But when she glanced at Ethan, she saw his stance, wide, unyielding, a fortress of flesh and bone standing for her. And something inside her shifted. Before Ethan could answer, Clara stepped forward. Her voice, though trembling, carried clear across the yard. "You'll not touch this land, and you'll not touch me." The bandit stilled, taken aback. The wind tugged at her dress. The laundry she dropped fluttering like pale flags on the porch behind her. She stood with her chin lifted, hands balled tight at her sides, heart thundering like hooves in her chest. Scarjaw barked a laugh. "Look at that. The cursed girl thinks she's got teeth." But Clara didn't flinch. For the first time in so long, she wasn't ashamed of who she was. She was angry. Angry at the whispers, at the cruel eyes, at being treated like something less than human. And standing here, with Ethan's shadow at her side, she realized she wasn't powerless anymore. "If you've come for a fight," she said, her voice steadier now, "then you'll find more than you bargained for." Ethan's gaze flicked toward her, surprised but proud. He shifted his rifle into his hands, calm and measured. "You heard her. This ranch isn't yours to claim. Last chance to leave with your bones intact." The standoff broke like a snap rope. One of the bandits lunged forward, firing a shot that sent splinters flying from the porch railing. Ethan answered with his rifle, the crack echoing across the valley. Chaos erupted. Horses screamed, men shouted, and gunfire split the afternoon silence. Clara ducked behind the water trough as bullets whined past. Fear clawed at her throat, but when she saw Ethan pinned behind the corral fence, outnumbered, something fierce surged through her. She snatched up the old pistol Ethan kept by the cabin door. It was heavy in her hands, but she gritted her teeth, aimed at a bandit riding too close, and pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, and the man toppled from his horse with a curse. The bandits hadn't expected her to fight. Their confidence faltered, and Ethan pressed the advantage. He moved with the precision of a man who'd lived through too many battles, driving them back shot by shot. Clara's hand shook violently, but she held her ground, reloading clumsily, firing again when another rider charged. Within minutes, the bandits realized they were outmatched. Scarjaw spat blood into the dust, glaring at Clara with venom. "This ain't over, girl. You've made yourself a mark." Then, with a sharp whistle, he and his men wheeled their horses and thundered away, leaving the ranch in a haze of gun smoke and churned earth. The silence afterward was deafening. Clara's chest heaved, her hand still trembling as she lowered the pistol. Ethan strode toward her, his eyes blazing, not with anger, but with something fiercer. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice rough. "I wasn't," Clara whispered back. She lifted her chin, though tears threatened. "And I won't hide anymore, Ethan. Not from them. Not from anyone." For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Her defiance, her strength, burned in her eyes. And in his, she saw the weight of solitude cracking, making space for something new, admiration, respect, something deeper still. He reached out, slowly, as though afraid she'd vanish if he moved too fast. His callous hand brushed her cheek, rough fingers tracing the smudge of dirt there. Clara's breath caught, her whole body trembling now not from fear, but from the closeness of him. The world narrowed to firelight in his eyes, to the warmth of his hand cupping her face. He leaned closer, shadows and sunlight playing across the hard line of his jaw. She felt the pull, sharp and undeniable, their lips hovering a breath apart. For one suspended heartbeat, it seemed the loneliness of two broken souls might finally give way to something whole. But Ethan pulled back, jaw tight. His hand lingered a second longer before falling away. "Not yet," he murmured, almost himself. Clara swallowed, her heart aching with both longing and relief. She didn't know what held him back. Fear, guilt, the way of the past. But she knew one thing with sudden certainty. Whatever trial came next, they would face it together. And for the first time, that thought didn't terrify her. It gave her strength. The night after the attack was heavy with silence. The bandits had gone, the smoke cleared. Yet the echoes of gunfire still haunted the cabin walls. Clara sat near the hearth, her dress stained with dust, her hands raw from gripping the pistol. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the sneers of men, the glint of steel, the fall of the rider she had shot. But beyond the fear was something stronger, something that frightened her even more. The memory of Ethan's hand brushing her cheek, of how close his lips had come to hers. Ethan moved about the cabin with the restless gait of a man battling storms no one else could see. He set the rifle back on its hooks, checked the locks on the doors and windows, stoked the fire higher, all without speaking a word. His silence pressed down heavier than the gun smoke had, filling the small cabin until Clara could hardly breathe. Finally, unable to stand it, she whispered, "You should have let them laugh at me. I could have borne it." He stopped in his tracks, turning to her sharply. "Don't you say that." His voice cracked through the air, raw and urgent. "I've watched this town tear at you like vultures. I've watched you bow your head and take it, because that's what they trained you to do. But you—" He came closer, his boots striking the floor with force. His eyes burned like twin embers in the firelight. "You're not theirs to scorn. You're not broken. You're not unwanted." Clara's throat tightened. "Then what am I?" He stared at her, jaw tense, as though the words had been locked inside him for years. And then, slowly, he spoke them. "They saw nothing in you, but I see everything I ever prayed for." The fire popped, sending sparks leaping, but Clara hardly noticed. Tears blurred her eyes. "You can't mean that," she whispered. "You don't know what I am. You don't know how it feels to be thrown aside like spoiled bread, to wake up every morning knowing people laugh at the very sight of you, to wonder if maybe they're right, that maybe you don't deserve love at all." Her voice broke. She pressed her hands to her face, shame washing over her, but Ethan crossed the space between them in 2 strides. He caught her wrist gently, pulling her hands away so she couldn't hide. "I do know," he said, voice rough. "I buried a wife and son. I've lived every day since with people whispering behind my back. The cursed cowboy, the widower who couldn't protect his family. I've drowned in the same silence that's drowning you now. Don't tell me I don't understand, Clara." Her tears spilled over, not from weakness, but from the shock of hearing her pain spoken aloud by another soul who carried his own scars. "Then why me?" she asked brokenly. "Why would you ever choose me?" "Because when I look at you," Ethan said, his voice breaking with the weight of it, "I don't see ruin. I see the strongest woman I've ever met. I see someone who stood up to men twice her size, who faced down her own fear with shaking hands and still pulled the trigger. I see someone who makes this empty place feel alive again. That's why." Clara's breath shuddered. His hand still held her wrists, warm and steady, anchoring her to the moment. Slowly, almost without thinking, her fingers curled against his palms. She lifted her gaze to his, and in his eyes she found no mockery, no pity, no hesitation. Only truth, fierce and unyielding. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling with both fear and longing. "I don't know if I could be what you see in me." His thumb brushed her skin, tender where his calluses pressed. "You already are." The words broke her completely. A sob tore free, but before the shame could follow, he pulled her into his arms. His chest was solid, his embrace strong, and for the first time since her world had shattered, Clara felt safe enough to fall apart. She clung to him, burying her face against him as tears soaked through his shirt. And he held her, not as a burden, not as a fragile thing, but as if she were the missing piece of his own battered heart. When she finally lifted her head, her face was still damp with tears, but a strange calm had replaced the storm inside her. Ethan's hands lingered at her back, then rose to frame her face. The firelight gilded his features, softening the hard lines, revealing the man beneath the armor of solitude. Their eyes locked, breath mingling. No words were left between them, no space for doubt. Slowly, deliberately, Ethan lowered his head. Clara felt her heart stutter, then race, then break open entirely as his lips met hers. It wasn't a tentative brush, not a hesitant test. It was deep, sure, powerful. A kiss that carried all the words he hadn't spoken, all the years of grief he hadn't shared, all the love he hadn't dared to hope for. Clara melted into it, answering with her own unspoken confession that she, too, had thought herself incapable of this, and yet here she was alive again in his arms. The kiss deepened, and the world outside ceased to exist. The storm of the day, the shadows of the past, the cruelties of the town, all of it fell away. There was only the fire crackling in the hearth, the steady beat of his heart beneath her hands, and the taste of something she had never known before, a love that healed instead of hurt. When at last they broke apart, both were breathing hard, their foreheads resting together. Ethan closed his eyes, his voice rough as gravel. This cabin was nothing but wood and silence before you. Now it's home. Clara smiled through her tears, her heart swelling with a fragile but undeniable hope. She touched his face, letting her fingers trace the scar at his temple. Then let it be our home, no matter what comes. Ethan kissed her again, softer this time, sealing the vow not with words, but with something far stronger. And in that moment, the lonely cabin ceased to be a shelter of solitude. It became a sanctuary of love, a place where two broken souls had finally found each other. The town was never kind, but whispers had begun to shift. Where once Clara had been mocked as the bride no one wanted, now people spoke of her in hushed awe. They remembered the night of the bandits, how she had stood beside Ethan with trembling hands but unflinching courage. They saw the way she now carried herself, not bent under shame, but tall, as though she finally knew her own worth. And beside her, Ethan moved with a quiet pride, no longer the widowed recluse, but a man with purpose again. At first, the townsfolk struggled with their own guilt. The very women who once turned their backs now offered shy nods when Clara passed by with her basket of supplies. The men at the saloon, who once laughed behind their whiskey glasses, now lowered their gaze in a grudging kind of respect when Ethan entered with her on his arm. They had called her unwanted, but now they could not deny what was plain before their eyes. She had become the heart of a man they had all thought unshakable. Life on the ranch slowly began to bloom, in a way neither of them had thought possible. Where weeds had once overtaken the fences, now Clara's careful hands planted wildflowers that danced in the wind. Ethan worked the land with renewed strength, and Clara worked beside him, her laughter ringing across the fields when he teased her about her crooked rows of corn or the way she sometimes startled at the neigh of a horse. The cabin, too, changed. It was no longer just a place for Ethan to bury his silence. Clara filled it with warmth, embroidered curtains she stitched herself, the soft glow of candles in the evenings, the scent of bread baking on the hearth. Ethan, in turn, built her a swing on the porch, his hand steady as he carved the wood. Together they turned loneliness into life, and with each passing season, their bond grew stronger, stitched together by the small, unspoken act of love that filled their days. But still, Clara carried the shadow of doubt within her heart. On a quiet evening, as they sat watching the sun sink into the horizon, she whispered, "What if they're only pretending? What if deep down they'll never forget who I was to them?" Her voice trembled, haunted by the echoes of her old humiliation. Ethan turned to her, his gaze unwavering. "Let them think what they want," he said firmly. "They don't get to decide your worth. Not anymore. Not ever again." She lowered her eyes. "But it's hard to forget." He reached for her hand, rough and warm, callous from years of toil, but gentle as he enclosed her fingers in his. "Then let me remind you, every day for the rest of my life. That's my vow. true to his words. He kept reminding her. When the barn roof collapsed during a summer storm, Ethan rebuilt it not alone, but with Clara helping him carry planks and nails. When she burned her hands on the stove one winter night, he bandaged them himself, his touch careful, his eyes full of something deeper than tenderness. And when the townsfolk invited him for church suppers or offered a smile at the market, he was always by her side, not as her savior, but as her equal partner, her shield when needed, her quiet strength always. In those moments, Claire began to understand that love was not just fire and passion. It was work. It was laughter shared over mended fences, arguments smoothed by gentle apologies, long nights of exhaustion made easier because they bore the weight together. It was Ethan waking early to fetch water, so she could sleep longer, and Clara stitching his shirts late into the night, because she wanted him to feel cared for. It was simply forever. The ranch flourished under their hands. What had once been a place of solitude and decay now thrummed with life. Horses galloped freely in the corral. The fields grew green and strong, and the cabin porch became a sanctuary where two people who once thought themselves broken built something whole together. Neighbors began to visit, some offering tools, others bringing fresh bread or seeds. They came out of curiosity at first, but stayed because they saw what was undeniable. This ranch and this love was stronger than the scorn they had once thrown like stones. And slowly, the whispers of mockery were replaced by words of admiration. Clara was no longer the unwanted bride. She was Ethan's partner, the woman who had turned forgotten Cowboy's ranch into a home filled with light. On a late autumn evening, when the air was crisp and the sky painted in streaks of gold and violet, Ethan stood with Clara on the porch. The horizon stretched endlessly before them, the land they had built together glowing under the dying sun. He held her hand, their fingers entwined, and for a long time they simply stood in silence, letting the peace of the moment wash over them. Then, in a steady, low voice, Ethan spoke. "Clara." She turned to him, her eyes catching the fire of the sunset. "Yes." He squeezed her hand, his eyes never leaving hers. "You'll never be unwanted again. To me, you're everything." Her heart swelled, her breath catching in her chest. Tears brimmed in her eyes, but this time they were not from sorrow. She leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder as the wind whispered to the fields around them. The cabin behind them glowed warmly with firelight, the scent of baked bread drifting through the air. The land stretched vast and open, no longer empty, but full of promise. Clara closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, she felt no weight of shame, no ache of loneliness. She felt only the strength of his arm around her, the steady beat of his heart, and the certainty of forever. And so, with the horizon before them and the future unfolding at their feet, Clara and Ethan stood together, no longer broken, no longer unwanted, but bound in a love that time itself could not undo. The porch creaked beneath them, the swing swayed gently, and the world seemed to settle into stillness as the sun dipped away. For in that quiet, they had found what they had always been searching for: healing, love, and eternal companionship.